It was a Tuesday morning like any other. Laughter echoing in the hallways, backpacks slung over shoulders, notes passed before class. No one knew that within minutes, those same hallways would become a battlefield. At 11:19 a.m., two students walked into Columbine High School, not as classmates, but as executioners. They carried guns, homemade bombs, and a plan that would haunt America forever. By the time the smoke cleared, 13 innocent lives were gone, 24 more were wounded, and the world was forced to ask a question it still hasn't answered. Why? Why did two suburban teenagers turn their school into a slaughterhouse? And could anyone have stopped them? This is the story of Columbine, not just what happened that day, but everything we refused to see before it. The sound of the final school bell, lockers closing, laughter fading into chaos. Before we dive into that terrible April morning, we need to understand how two ordinary-looking teenagers, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, grew into the architects of one of America's darkest days. Because Columbine wasn't born in a single moment, it was built slowly, in silence, secrecy, and digital shadows no one was watching. Littleton, Colorado, 1999. A middle-class suburb wrapped in calm. Families shopped at strip malls. Teens cruised to fast food joints. Teachers prepared for prom week. To outsiders, Columbine High was the picture of safety. Wide halls, clean lawns, championship banners. But beneath that veneer was the same quiet tension brewing in countless American schools. Social hierarchies, bullying, and the suffocating need to fit in. Students were divided into invisible tribes: athletes, preps, goths, band kids, loners. And in those corners of isolation, resentment took root. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold didn't stand out much at first glance. One was meticulous, analytical, charismatic in a dark way. The other, introspective, awkward, often lost in thought. They laughed at the same jokes, shared video game sessions, and confided about how alien they felt in a world obsessed with popularity and perfection. What no one realized, not parents, not teachers, not classmates, was that the two had stopped merely feeling different. They'd begun to believe the world itself deserved punishment. Eric Harris started writing online rants, detailed venom-filled manifestos on early web pages and message boards. He described fantasies of destruction, superiority, and revenge against the idiots he believed surrounded him. Dylan Klebold, meanwhile, filled notebooks with poetry and pain, lines about death, loneliness, and wanting to disappear. Together they became each other's echo chamber, feeding rage with rage, sharpening hate with validation. Teachers noticed occasional dark essays. Parents noticed temper swings, but nothing seemed alarming enough to predict catastrophe. After all, it was the late 90s. Teen angst was everywhere, in music, movies, culture. Adults brushed it off as rebellion. But behind closed doors, Eric and Dylan were collecting guns, ammunition, and parts for homemade bombs, transforming their bedrooms into arsenals while still attending class each day, as if nothing was wrong. 1999. America was a paradox. The economy thrived, yet discontent simmered under the surface. Video games like Doom and Quake were defining a generation fascinated by digital violence. News channels glamorized rebellion while ignoring the quiet suffering of youth. Mental health wasn't discussed openly. Therapy carried stigma. Schools prioritized grades and sports over emotional safety. In this environment, two teenagers slipped through every crack. Unnoticed, unseen, unheard. Eric idolized military power and control. Dylan longed for peace but felt trapped in despair. Their friendship fused those contradictions into something deadly: cold precision and chaotic emotion. 2 years before the massacre, a classmate reported Eric's online threats to police. They found detailed blog posts about making bombs and killing people. But the file was never pursued. Months later, both Eric and Dylan were arrested for breaking into a van and stealing electronics. They were sent to a diversion program, wrote apologies, and were released early. Their records were wiped clean. Counselors praised their progress. Parents were relieved, but behind smiles, the boys were drafting plans titled NBK, short for Natural Born Killers. They recorded home videos dressed in trench coats, pretending to shoot imaginary students, mocking teachers, laughing about their future fame. They weren't just venting, they were rehearsing. In the weeks before the attack, they filmed a final tape, what investigators later called the basement tapes. On it, they spoke directly to the camera, apologizing to their parents but justifying the slaughter they were about to commit. Eric's tone was calm, almost proud. Dylan's voice trembled between guilt and excitement. They wrote in their journals about timing the bombs to detonate in the cafeteria, about maximizing casualties, about being remembered forever. They believed they were rewriting the rules of society. The night before, they went bowling with friends. They laughed. They acted normal. No one suspected that hours later, they would step into the hallways of Columbine carrying shotguns, carbines, and homemade explosives. When the first shots echoed through the school, America's illusion of safety shattered. Columbine wasn't just another act of violence. It was a cultural rupture. It forced parents, educators, and lawmakers to confront questions no one wanted to ask. How could children plan mass murder without being noticed? Why were weapons so accessible to teenagers? What role did bullying, media, and mental health truly play? The massacre would redefine school safety forever. But the roots of that tragedy were already buried deep in years of neglect, silence, and denial. Imagine the clock striking 11:19 a.m. Imagine hearing what you think is a locker slamming, only it isn't. Screams ripple down the hallway. Fire alarms wail. You're 17, hiding under a table in the library as footsteps approach. You hear laughter, then gunfire. The story you thought you knew is about to unfold from the inside, through the eyes of those who lived through one of the darkest days in American history. At first, we thought it was a joke. That's what survivors would later say. The first gunshots sounded like firecrackers outside the west entrance. A prank, a senior stunt maybe, but then came the screaming. Real, raw, and unbroken. And suddenly everyone knew. It wasn't a prank. It was war. The time was 11:19 a.m. The place, Columbine High School. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold had just begun their assault. The cafeteria was chaos. About 400 students were eating lunch when the fire alarms began blaring. Smoke from a small explosion outside drifted in through shattered glass. Tables overturned, trays crashed, people screamed, unsure where to run. I remember the smell of metal, one student later recalled, and everyone just started running toward the back exit, shoving, crying, falling over chairs. Teachers tried to herd students out, shouting for calm. But how do you calm hundreds of terrified kids who just heard their classmates screaming outside? No one knew that 2 large propane bombs had been planted under one of the cafeteria tables. They were set to detonate at 11:17 a.m., just 2 minutes before the shooting started, but they failed to explode. Had they gone off, investigators later estimated over 400 people would have died in that room alone. Gunfire echoed through the hallways like thunder in a tunnel. Every sound magnified, every second stretched. We dropped to the floor, hiding behind lockers, said one sophomore. The bullets sounded closer each time. Teachers barricaded doors with desks. Some whispered prayers. Others whispered to their students, "Don't move, don't make a sound." One teacher, Dave Sanders, ran toward danger. He shouted for students to take cover, directing them down stairways and into classrooms. He saved dozens before he was shot. Bleeding, he was dragged into a science lab where students tried desperately to stop the bleeding with their hands. He survived for over 3 hours, long enough to know help was coming, but not long enough for it to arrive. This was where most of the horror unfolded. At 11:29 a.m., Eric and Dylan entered the library, a room filled with nearly 50 students. Inside, the atmosphere was paralyzed. Whispers, sobs, trembling hands clutching phones that couldn't dial out. "We heard them laughing," one survivor said, "like it was a game." The shooters moved between tables, shouting, asking questions, mocking those who cried. Some students tried to hide beneath desks. Others prayed out loud. They fired at random, at computers, windows, bookshelves. The air filled with gunpowder and screams. One girl whispered a prayer as Eric turned toward her table. Another survivor remembered hearing him say, "Peekaboo," before firing. In 7 minutes, 10 students were killed in that room alone. When Eric and Dylan finally left the library, they reloaded their weapons. Then they walked calmly down the hall, their footsteps echoing among the dead and the living who dared not breathe. Outside, chaos reigned. Police surrounded the building but were unsure how many shooters there were or where they were hiding. Students ran from exits, hands raised, faces streaked with blood and dust. Parents gathered at the perimeter, begging officers for information. Inside, the killers roamed. They shot at fleeing students through windows. They fired at arriving officers. They returned to the cafeteria, trying again to detonate the bombs, but they failed once more. For nearly an hour, the sound of gunfire, explosions, and sirens merged into one unending nightmare. It's impossible to tell this story without glimpsing the psychology behind it. Eric Harris, in his journals, wrote about superiority, the idea that he was a god among sheep. He wanted recognition, fame, power. Dylan Klebold's writings, however, showed despair, a longing for death, for release, for meaning in self-destruction. Together, they believed their massacre would inspire others. They spoke of revenge, of revolution, of justice for the outcasts. But what they truly created was a blueprint for evil, one that would haunt generations to come. By 12:08 p.m., the shooting had stopped. Eric and Dylan turned their weapons on themselves in the library. The silence that followed was deafening. SWAT teams entered hours later, stepping over shattered glass and backpacks left open mid-lunch. The final death toll, 13 victims, 12 students and 1 teacher, 24 more wounded, hundreds traumatized for life. Outside, parents waited in unbearable silence as lists of survivors were read. Some heard their children's names. Others never did. The news broke across America, anchor voices shaking as images of terrified teenagers filled the screens. President Clinton addressed the nation that night. Vigils formed within hours, but no one could answer the question echoing in every living room. How could this happen here? Columbine wasn't just a tragedy. It was a mirror. It forced America to confront its schools, its parents, its culture of violence, and the cracks in its soul. The investigation that followed revealed disturbing truths about warning signs ignored, systems that failed, and the new era of fear that would follow every child into every classroom thereafter. Because Columbine didn't end that day, it only began. Watch out for the concluding massacre stories of the Columbine High School in our next video.